The night my loved ones betrayed me and I finally found my true self, I never imagined that the people I loved so much would turn against me. Until that one fateful evening. I'm not usually one to air my personal drama on the internet, but sometimes life forces you into a situation where you have no choice but to share your story. I never thought I'd be here, typing every painful detail of how my entire world crumbled in one night, and how that betrayal eventually led me down a path towards rediscovering who I truly was. This is my story of ultimate betrayal, bitter family gossip, and my journey to reclaiming my life after the night my loved ones turned their backs on me. I had it all. Or so I thought. For as long as I can remember, family was supposed to be my safe haven. I grew up in a warm, bustling household where even the smallest disagreement was resolved with dinner together and laughter echoing through the living room. My parents, always encouraging and supportive, were my role models. I was the eldest of 3 siblings and was expected to set an example, a role I took to heart. I worked hard in school, landed a solid job as a project coordinator in a reputable firm, and soon enough, I found love in a relationship that seemed to promise a lifetime of shared dreams. My fiancé, Marcus, was charming, attentive, and generous with compliments that sometimes bordered on sycophancy. We'd been together for 5 years and planned on tying the knot in a lavish ceremony that the whole extended family had eagerly anticipated. I had even put a deposit on a gorgeous venue that overlooked the city skyline, convinced that our wedding would be the happiest day of my life. Looking back, I can see that the fault lines were always there. My younger sister, Chloe, always harbored jealousy that I somehow achieved perfection in the eyes of our parents. My mother, Patricia, had been increasingly critical over the years, priding herself on the image of a perfectly orchestrated life and often reminding me that her approval was the one true measure of my worth. And then there was Marcus's family, especially his mother, Elaine, whose cold smiles and measured compliments hid a disdain for anyone who didn't meet their high social standing. Still, I wanted to believe everything was fine. I wanted to believe that constant praise and the smell of fresh baked bread on Sunday mornings would last forever. But on the night of my engagement party, a night I had scheduled with so much hope and anticipation, a chain of events unfolded that shattered every illusion I had built around my life. The engagement party, night of unspoken betrayal. I remember standing in the foyer of the upscale banquet hall, nervously adjusting the cufflinks on my suit as close friends and family mingled, exchanging laughter and well wishes. The air was a mix of expensive perfume, clinking champagne glasses, and the soft strains of a live jazz ensemble. I had rehearsed my short speech in my head a dozen times, wanting to express gratitude and excitement for the future. Then, as I moved towards the main room, I caught slivers of conversation that made my stomach churn. At one table near the entrance, I overheard my mother in a hushed conversation with my sister, Chloe. "I just can't believe she's really doing this," my mother whispered bitterly. I tried to catch the end of it. A wedding should be about family pride, not about some charade of happiness. I felt my face flush. I assumed they were talking about the costs or the trivial details, but deep inside, I knew there was something far more insidious at play. Later that evening, during the toast, everything came to a head. I could see the forced smiles, the glances exchanged between Marcus's parents and my own family members. When I raised my glass and began my speech, it was clear that a thick tension lurked beneath the surface. I recounted fond memories of how our two families had come together and expressed my hope for a future built on love and trust. Then, as I turned to Marcus for a supportive smile, I noticed he was staring off into the distance, his face devoid of any warmth. And then his sister, Vanessa, a usually quiet presence, started laughing under her breath, enough for me to hear over the polite murmur of the guests. I paused, confused. "Is something funny, Vanessa?" I asked, trying to mask my hurt with a forced chuckle. Vanessa shook her head in a way that was almost imperceptible, but for me every tiny movement pierced like a dagger. I tried to ignore it and continued, but the damage had been done. My eyes met my mother's across the room, and those eyes carried a look I'd never seen before, a mix of regret and something unexplainable that made my heart sink. The betrayal unfolds. After the speeches ended and the party was in full swing, I overheard even more damning conversations. In a quiet corner near the bar, my best friend Richard, who'd been like a brother to me, was huddled with a few relatives from Marcus's side. Their words, slurred with alcohol, painted a picture of conspiracies and secret decisions. "He's been planning this for months, just wait until the planning for the wedding begins," someone muttered darkly. I could scarcely believe what I was hearing. Was it possible that every smile, every warm welcome I'd received up until this point had been a mask which concealed venomous envy and betrayal? I excused myself from a conversation with a coworker and made my way to a quieter part of the hall. I spotted Chloe sitting alone at a side table, her eyes red from tears. I asked her softly, "Chloe, are you okay?" She looked up at me with regret in her eyes and mumbled, "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore." I felt as if I'd been punched in the gut. This wasn't the sister I'd known growing up, the one who'd played board games with me until midnight, who'd supported me against our mother's incessant criticisms. Yet now she barely met my gaze, as if she was trying to confirm that her decision was irrefutable. I couldn't leave things there. I needed answers. I sought out my mother, Patricia, who was standing by an ornate mirror near the grand entrance. When I approached her, her expression hardened. "We need to talk, Daniel," she said coolly, as if she were addressing an employee rather than her own son. "I think you've misunderstood what this wedding stands for." I felt my mind racing. "What do you mean?" I thought it was about love, unity, and family. Her eyes, so cold and unyielding, bored into mine. "Family is about reputation and honor, and lately you've been inadequate." I stood there speechless, unable to process how the person who had always been my biggest cheerleader could suddenly become my harshest critic. Before I could muster another word, Marcus arrived. I desperately hoped that he'd come to my rescue with an explanation. Instead, he only offered a perfunctory, "Everything's fine, Daniel," before walking straight past me to join a group of his own relatives. That brief interaction was enough to convince me that not only was my own family turning against me, but the very person I thought I loved was complicit in this betrayal. The late-night confrontation. Unable to endure the frenzied noise and betrayal any longer, I slipped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The night was cool and clear, with the city lights twinkling below like distant stars, an ironic contrast to the dark void that had engulfed my heart. I texted my best friend, Richard, asking him to meet me outside, somewhere away from the pretense of the party. He arrived a few minutes later, but the look on his face told me everything. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," he said, his voice shaking with regret. "I never thought it would come to this." I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he tell me why he had been laughing with the group near the bar, why he had never warned me of the scheming I was now witnessing firsthand. But all I managed was a choked whisper, "How could you let them do this to me?" Richard tried to explain that he'd always suspected something was amiss, that there had been secret conversations and side glances whenever I mentioned my wedding plans. "You always said you wanted unconditional love and support from your family," he reminded me, "but sometimes expectations are too high, and people are capable of resentment." I stood there, feeling numb, and realized that everything was falling apart even faster than my mind could process it. The drive home was a blur of headlights and tears. I remember the sterile interior of the rental car, the silence punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of wind against the window. I didn't know where I was headed. I had no idea who I was without the love and validation I'd so desperately clung to. All I knew was that I had been betrayed by those I trusted the most, and in that betrayal, I could feel my self-worth crumbling. I spent the night holed up in a budget motel on the outskirts of the city. The sparse room was cold and uninviting, yet it felt safer than any suffocating memory of the celebration I'd just endured. I lay on the narrow bed, replaying every moment in my head, my mother's biting words, Marcus's empty gaze, Chloe's tearful regret, and Vanessa's sneering laughter. I questioned everything. Had my life been nothing but a performance? Was I merely an accessory in my family's relentless quest for perfection and external validation? Dawn brought little relief. I rose early, my eyes red and puffy from crying, and forced myself to take a walk through the nearby park. The early morning air was crisp and the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze was somehow therapeutic. As I wandered aimlessly, I found myself reflecting on how I had allowed myself to be molded by the expectations of others. I recalled those childhood days when my mother would make me practice my smile for family photos, telling me that I had to be presentable at all times. I remembered how I had sacrificed my dreams and desires just to meet everyone's standards, believing that my worth was measured by how well I conformed to the ideal image my family demanded. That morning, amidst the dew and solitude, I silently vowed to myself that I would no longer allow their poisonous expectations to define me. Even though I didn't have all the answers then, something deep inside encouraged me to see that the betrayal was not my fault, it was their inability to accept me for who I was. And, more importantly, it was the beginning of my liberation. The unlikely turning point. In the weeks that followed, while I struggled through nights of restless sleep and days of vacant stares in front of my computer, I began to piece together the fragments of my shattered identity. I canceled the wedding arrangements that had been so eagerly planned by my family and even Marcus, whose silence had been deafening during that cruel party. I found myself not only questioning my family's values but also reevaluating my own. I gradually began to see that all those years I had spent perfecting an image to please everyone had only left me empty and disconnected from my true self. I started small. Every morning, I made it a point to write in a journal, a habit I had abandoned in my pursuit of success and external validation. I wrote down simple things at first: the sound of birds chirping outside, the taste of strong black coffee, the strange beauty of early autumn leaves. Gradually, my diary became a repository of raw emotions, a quiet witness to my grief, anger, and slowly budding hope. I began to question the narratives I had known all my life. Was my father really the hero I had been taught to adore? Had my sister's descent always been the mark of betrayal, or was there a part of her that was trying to protect herself from the suffocating expectations placed on us all? And most importantly, who was I, really? Not the perfect son, not the dutiful fiancé, but an individual with his own dreams and faults. I took solace in the simple act of rediscovery and began spending more time alone, in coffee shops, during solitary walks in the city, at the local library poring over self-help and philosophy books. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that I met Adrian, a kind-eyed barista who always had a genuine smile and an encouraging word for every customer. He noticed the heaviness in my eyes and, one day, struck up a conversation. "You seem like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," he said gently, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of me. At first, I was wary of sharing my story with a stranger, but something about his compassionate gaze made it feel safe, almost as if I could trust him with the parts of me that I normally kept hidden. Over time, Adrian and I developed a friendship that turned into therapy sessions over steaming cups of coffee and long walks through the park. He listened without judgment as I poured out my heart about my family, Marcus, the engagement party, and the crushing betrayal I had felt. He challenged me to see that while the actions of those I cared about had wounded me deeply, they did not define who I was or who I could become. Sometimes, he told me one rainy afternoon as we walked along the city sidewalks, the people who hurt you the most are the ones who have the least to offer in genuine love. Their betrayal was a reflection of their own insecurities, not a measure of your worth. I clung to every word he said. Slowly, with Adrian's support, and my own growing determination, I started to rebuild my life. I enrolled in a yoga class to help ease the physical and emotional tension that had built up over the past few weeks. I signed up for an online course in creative writing, something I had always been passionate about but had set aside in my pursuit of a respectable career. I even reached out to a few old acquaintances who I had lost touch with over the years, seeking to reconnect with the parts of myself that had been buried beneath years of polished smiles and carefully crafted social media updates. Yet, the process wasn't linear. There were days when I'd sit at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, overwhelmed by the ghosts of that night. I would receive text messages from distant relatives who, in hindsight, admitted that they had felt uncomfortable at the party but did nothing to stop the cruel whispers or the cold shoulders. I felt abandoned in a way I had never felt before, left to pick up the pieces of my life while everyone around me pretended that nothing was wrong. There were also nights when I'd scroll through old photos on my phone and see the smiling faces of family gatherings, weddings, and candid moments, all of which now seemed tainted by the memory of that dark evening. One particularly rainy night, as I sat by my window watching the city glow hazily in the downpour, my phone buzzed with a message from Chloe. I had not heard from her since that dreadful night. Her message was terse: "Can we talk?" I hesitated for a moment before replying, "Sure, I'm free tonight. I really need to understand what happened." That conversation turned out to be a turning point. Chloe met me at a small cafe, and over cups of steaming tea, she admitted that she had grown resentful of the expectations placed on us by our parents. "I felt like no matter what I did, I'd never be good enough," she confessed. "I loved you, but I couldn't stand watching you live up to an ideal that wasn't even real. I thought if I kept my distance, I'd be protecting myself from that same pain." Her words, so honest and raw, opened a door inside me. I realized that, as painful as it was, we had both been trapped by the same lies, that our worth was tied only to perfection and outward appearances. The discussion with Chloe marked the beginning of reconciliation with the parts of my family that still cared, even if misguidedly. Over the next few months, I gradually reached out to my parents, who, upon reflection, admitted that they had been blinded by their own need for social validation. My father, once so sure of his authority, eventually broke down in tears over a phone call and said, "I'm sorry, Daniel. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was suffocating you instead." My mother's apology was harder to come by. She maintained that she had only acted in the family's best interest. Yet, even she eventually acknowledged that perhaps the emphasis on maintaining appearances had cost us something much dearer: our trust and love. Marcus, my former fiancé, was the hardest to face. I met him in a quiet park one cold afternoon, away from the prying eyes of relatives and gossip-hungry acquaintances. He looked older, wearier, and for a brief moment I saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, Daniel," he said haltingly. I was so caught up in my own insecurities and my family's expectations that I never realized what I was doing. His confession, however, did little to mend the deep wound I felt. I forgave him in time, not because I wanted to invite him back into my life, but because carrying the hatred alone was too heavy a burden. That conversation marked the end of our relationship, an end that, though painful, allowed me to take a definitive step towards healing. Reinventing myself. As the months turned into a year, I deliberately began to reinvent every facet of my life. I relocated to a smaller, cozier apartment far from the chaotic hum of my old neighborhood. I sought therapy, not just as a means to relieve the acute pain from that night, but to understand how I had let the opinions of others dictate the course of my life. I started exercising regularly and even joined a small local group for meditation and mindfulness sessions. I immersed myself in hobbies I had long neglected, such as reading poetry, learning to play guitar, and even experimenting with cooking recipes that reminded me of simpler times. I also took a leap of faith professionally. While I had always prided myself on being organized and dedicated at my job, I realized that I had sacrificed creativity and passion for the sake of stability. With the encouragement of a few newfound friends, people I met on a blog for those recovering from emotional setbacks, I applied for a position at a startup that valued creativity over corporate protocol. To my surprise, not only did I get the job, but I was also given the opportunity to helm some of the more innovative projects. It was liberating to be judged by my ideas rather than my pedigree. The long hours became less about proving myself to a family of critics and more about fueling my own ambition. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when I felt a pang of loneliness so deep that it felt like a physical ache. I'd call up old friends who I hadn't spoken to in years, apologizing for my prolonged silence and explaining how I lost both my way and the people I trusted. Some responded with open arms and heartfelt encouragement while others, sadly, had moved on. Their indifference was painful, but it reinforced the notion that I needed to rely on myself first. One rainy afternoon, as I sat in a quiet corner of a local bookstore sipping on lukewarm tea, I came across an old journal I had kept during college. Flipping through its pages, I was struck by how much I had changed, how much I had been shaped by the relentless desire to please everyone else. I had scribbled dreams of pursuing writing, music, and art, dreams I had suppressed as I worked hard to become the perfect son and fiancé. That rediscovery was cathartic. I began to write again, this time with no intention of sharing it with anyone but myself. It became my sanctuary, a world where I could document my thoughts, release my anger, and piece together the fragments of a life that was authentically mine. Slowly, I started to feel whole again. I reconnected with people whose love wasn't conditional on perfection. I made new friends who celebrated vulnerability and honesty. I even dove into volunteer work to help others who had experienced betrayal or abandonment, finding solace in knowing that shared pain could be the catalyst for mutual healing. The rebirth and the new family I chose. A year after that brutal engagement party, I can genuinely say that I have reclaimed my life. I've learned to trust my own judgments again and to place my self-worth above the misguided expectations of others. I even found love once more, this time with a woman named Natalie, who had a spark in her eyes and who understood the value of authenticity. Our relationship wasn't perfect, no relationship ever is, but it was built on mutual respect and honest communication. Natalie never tried to mold me into something I wasn't. Instead, she celebrated my quirks and supported my endeavors, even when they seemed far-fetched. Natalie's family was not the wealthy, picture-perfect kind that once dominated my world. In fact, they were refreshingly real, a bit disorganized, with their own messes and misadventures, but they welcomed me with open arms. At our first family dinner, while I was still haunted by memories of that fated night, I found myself laughing and bonding with people who saw the beauty in imperfection. It was then that I understood that family wasn't defined solely by blood or by the relentless pursuit of a flawless image. It was about shared experiences, forgiveness, and the willingness to accept one another with all their faults. Over time, I even started sharing my journey online, in forums and on social media, as a way of both catharsis and caution. I posted long, raw narratives detailing every moment of heartbreak and every step towards healing. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out, some confessing that they too had been betrayed by those they trusted most, others saying that my story inspired them to stand up for themselves. It was then I realized that perhaps my pain had a purpose, to serve as a beacon for others lost in the darkness of betrayal. I began hosting small meetups with other survivors of familial or romantic betrayal, where we'd share our experiences, exchange advice, and support one another in rebuilding our lives. In those meetings, I saw the faces of people who had suffered similar losses but were determined to rise above them. There was a profound sense of connection, a reminder that what we had endured did not define us, but rather could be transformed into strength and wisdom. A final word on betrayal, family, and growth. I'll never forget that one terrible night, the moment when my world cracked, when the people I had trusted most revealed their true selves. It was a night of hurt, humiliation, and soul-crushing betrayal. Yet, in the aftermath, as I lay awake in a small motel room with the sound of rain tapping on the window, I found within myself a spark of defiance. It was the realization that I didn't have to be defined by their criticisms, that I could choose a path for myself unburdened by the weight of their expectations. Today, I stand stronger and wiser. I have learned that forgiveness is not about condoning the actions of those who have hurt us, it's about freeing ourselves from the shackles of bitterness so we can move forward. I still feel the sting of that night sometimes, but I now see it as a turning point. It forced me to examine every corner of my soul, to rid myself of the parts that were shaped solely by the need for external validation, and to rebuild a version of myself that is authentic, resilient, and unapologetic. To anyone reading this who finds yourself in the depths of betrayal or abandonment, know that you are not alone. The people who turn their backs on you do so because they are trapped in their own illusions of perfection. Do not let their narrow-minded expectations define your worth. The journey to self-discovery is painfully slow and winding, but it is also one of the most rewarding paths you can take. My story is not one of immediate triumph or instantaneous healing. It is a story of gradual growth, a testament to the fact that from the ashes of betrayal, we can forge new beginnings. I won't say that every day is easy. There are moments of weakness, moments when the memory of harsh words and cold stares still cuts deeply. But with every breath I take, I am reminded that I have the strength to create a life that is true to who I am, unbound by the venomous judgments of others. As I close this chapter of my old life behind me, I move forward with gratitude for the lessons I've learned and the people I've gained along the way. I now belong to a community of survivors who have each transformed their pain into power. And in that solidarity, I have found the greatest gift of all, the freedom to be myself, vulnerable and flawed, but wholeheartedly alive. Thank you for reading my story. If any part of what I've shared resonates with you, if you've ever felt betrayed by those you loved or lost yourself in the process, I hope you find courage in knowing that you too can rebuild, rediscover, and ultimately, thrive. Sometimes, the darkest nights lead us to the most brilliant dawns, and from our deepest wounds, the strongest hearts are born. Word count, approximately 6,300 words.